Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide divorce mediation and valuation services in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we are going to discuss passive appreciation in separate property in divorce and the external market forces with Dr. Ashok Abbott. He's an associate professor of finance at West Virginia University and founder of Business Valuation Incorporated, where he provides value by determining statistical significance, validating economic models, establishing causality, and providing rigorous empirical support. So major research. If you talk about population, you have personal income and you have population changes, but another factor that you have is inflation. And I think people just they conceptually know what inflation is, but how does that play into this kind of analysis?
See, inflation kind of myth has grown around inflation in economic data, especially in valuation. So somebody just comes on the stand and says, Your Honor, this is a 12-year period. The annual inflation rate, look at CPI, has been about 2 to 2.5% per year. So compounding over these 12 years, the revenues have grown by 75% as a result of inflation alone. So if the revenues have doubled, 75% of that 100% is passive. That's a very common, and on the face of it, it looks plausible. Sure, the revenues are going up, even if the demand is not going up, even if the number of products being sold is not going up, well, just the inflation raised the price.
Yeah, and everybody loves simple, right?
Simple, right? That's easy to wrap your head around. Except when you actually start peeling off this onion, what do you see? Inflation, the way inflation is known, is some kind of a index, consumer price index, CPI, common way to look at inflation. And it's very appealing. It's very standardized data. You start with the prices for a particular basket of consumption at a point in time. Like right now, what we have is the 2012. So the CPI that is being published every month is based on the price of those goods as of that month in 2012. Okay. Except, and that except is always where valuations become interesting. When we talk about inflation, it says all goods purchased by all consumers. Okay, all right, that's perfectly okay. However, it's interesting when you start looking for these indexes, there's also an index that says the price of new cars has changed by so much.
Right.
Year after year. The price of used cars has changed by so much. The price of food has changed by so much. Price of food and beverages has changed by so much. All of those indexes are available. Construction materials. So if we just take the CPI and apply it, let's say, to a bar, which may be an acceptable approximation, because the price of food and drink typically passes through the inflation. Okay. Now, if you take that same CPI and apply it to a car dealership, what has happened?
Right.
You have overestimated that inflation by about 5 times.
Right.
Because the new auto price inflation is much slower than the CPI, the consumer product inflation. Typically, the more necessary some product is, like food, for example, it's easy for the producer and the retailer to pass through that inflation to the customer.
Sure.
Because your can of milk, it goes from $2 to $2.20. You're not going to stop using that milk.
Right.
Okay. Now, if the price of your car goes from $30,000 to $36,000, you might say, okay, maybe I should go to the next dealership and look at another competing brand. So the ability of the higher the unit price of the product, the ability and less of a necessity it is, the ability of the producer to pass inflation on to the consumer gets limited. Look at airline travel. Over the last about 30 years, the per seat mile price has not changed. If anything, it has come down. I mean, especially if you're flying coach or business. The first class prices have stayed about the same. They have not inflated. But if you start looking at the per mile cost of flying coach or business, that has declined over the last 20 years. So if you were taking, for example, a travel agency's revenue and then applying CPI to it, you will be overestimating that growth by a very large factor.
That's very important. And I think that, you may have to search a little bit more for the data that's for each specific niche or industry, but it may be more complete and more indicative of the change, right?
And most important, see, if you are in litigation, what's going to happen? The other expert is going to find that data.
Right.
And is going to come in with that. Like when I'm involved in that, I will narrow down my data set to something that as closely approximates what is the particular business.